Hey guys, so I want to touch on the presuppositional arguments or tag arguments real quick, refute them. So the argument goes essentially something like this. Well, if knowledge, then God, we have knowledge, therefore God must exist, right? Kind of like that. So essentially they're presupposing that in order for even to have knowledge or to even do logic, God has to exist. And hence the atheist is illogical because they don't have God, so they can't do logic or have knowledge, right? That's essentially the gist of the argument. So the first problem with this is it's an assumption. You're just assuming that knowledge means God. Demonstrate that. The other problem here is you're asserting that no other account is possible. No other account for knowledge is possible. Atheism can't, or it's impossible for atheism to account for knowledge. Well, that implies a contradiction, right? When you invoke an impossibility or a logical impossibility, that implies there's a logical contradiction. What is it? What's the P and not P? If you can't give it, then your argument holds no weight. Just because an atheist cannot give you an account for these things doesn't mean that they're wrong or that yours is any better. The other point is, obviously, an atheist could generate some kind of hypothesis, right? We can generate some kind of natural entity. We can say nature accounts for these things. We can be a fictionalist about logic, right? We can say that it's not a real, it's kind of like an anti-realist position. It's not really a real thing. Logic is not a real thing in the universe. It's just a language. It's a linguistic framework that is created by the brain, right? It's perfectly fine to do that. It's perfectly valid to suggest that. But from there, the presuppositionalist will say something like, well, if logic comes from the brain, well then, how do you account for the fact that it's a universal? Well, this again asserts that logic must be a universal. And I think what they're trying to get there is logic applies everywhere, right? Logic is a universal because it applies everywhere. Well, first of all, universals in logic are essentially categories of properties that all objects have or share. For example, every tree you see has a treeness property to it. And that's what kind of, unites all the trees in the world or universe together. It's a universal property that they all share. Well, we can just reject that. Obviously, we can reject that notion. There's nothing about a tree that all trees must share. We can just hold to particulars. We can be a nominalist and say, well, particulars are the only things that exist, independent of minds. That's it. We don't need universals. That's nonsense. And the crux of the issue here is that the Presup usually wants to say something like logic prescribes reality. In other words, reality wouldn't exist without logic, right? That's what they would kind of suggest. Now, although it might seem like logic applies everywhere and it's universal and there's something real about logic that must exist everywhere in the universe, and we're kind of drawing from that, but that's not something that we have to hold to. Logic isn't something that the entire universe shares, and every crook and cranny of the universe shares logic. No, that's nonsense. We can just suggest that logic is a language. It's a model of describing the universe, the external world, right? And the external world is something that we're describing. It exists. Something exists. We don't know its true ontology, but it's there. Something's there, and we're describing it through logic. Perfectly valid. There's no reason to suggest that logic is universal. There's no reason that we must suggest that logic is prescriptive of reality. So to raise an analogy, let's suggest that GTA 5 is a game, and I have a physical map in my hand of GTA 5's territory. Well, I'm sorry, but the map in my hand is not making the game happen, right? What's happening is the map is describing the game. So if I take away the map to the game, well, the game's still there. So if I took away logic, the external world is still there. The external world doesn't go away if logic goes away, right? Logic is not prescriptive, it's descriptive. And that's a view that an atheist can hold. It's valid, and there's no reason to suggest that it's not. Another thing I hear is that determinism and knowledge are incompatible with each other. That if you're determined, you can't know something because you weren't able to freely choose that knowledge. But although that's what it might seem like, it feels like that, it's also something we can also reject. What's the argument for that? Another assertion on behalf of the Presup. What's the argument that knowledge cannot be attained if determinism is true? Well, they'll say something like, well, knowledge is something that you have to freely attain. Why? No, it's not. Does a calculator freely choose what is true? No, a calculator is determined. There's an input and an output, and the output, that's all determined, and it can generate truth claims. 1 + 1 is 2. That's a truth claim. That's a truth statement that it's outputting deterministically. And ChatGPT, for example, ChatGPT is another input-output deterministic process in which it's generating truths. And it can reason. Because after all reasoning is, all coming to truth is a systematic process happening in the brain. Right? Sets of axioms, statements, propositions. It's all funneled into a system that outputs reasoning or statements, truth statements. And that's what I suggest the brain's doing, right? For this, that logic is something that the brain is doing in the prefrontal cortex. And what logic really seems to be is just a set of neurons, the synapses firing in the brain and systematically generating thoughts. And these thoughts turn into propositions, sets of thoughts turn into propositions, and those turn into logical statements, frameworks. It's not a stretch to understand that this is a purely valid way of viewing logic as a linguistic framework by which we describe the world. And truth is also descriptive of the world, right? When we say something's true, all we're really saying is, yeah, this thing seems to correlate or correspond to what is real. And there are different types of truths, but there's different types of truths in philosophy. But the point is that a true or a false statement is something that the brain is generating through its reasoning faculties, deterministically. And it's simply the result of the brain trying to make sense of the external world. That's it. That's perfectly defendable. I don't need to resort to God or magic or revelation. And although it might be hard to digest the fact that we might not have free will, and that truth is determined to be this way, and that God doesn't exist, that might be hard to digest this. There's no reason why those kinds of Presup arguments work. And furthermore, when we really interrogate and question these Presuppers about their beliefs, what do? They say, well, we get our interest from God's revelation. God has revealed it to me. That's what they say. Okay, how? And how do you know the mechanism is true? How do you know that mechanism's working correctly? How do you know that you can trust what God's saying? There are many other problems that arise when you just say revelation or God reveals it to me. It's not like a done deal for you where you can say you're completely sound and everything's great. There are still questions to be answered under the Presup view. And you don't offer that same leeway when it comes to the atheist, right? In other words, the Presup loves to interrogate the atheist and say, well, how do you ground logic? How do you ground these things? If the atheist just said nature, which is a perfectly fine, valid conclusion, just say nature does it, all of a sudden the Presup is like, well, how does that happen? How does that? They're asking all these questions about how logic works and all these things. But we can do the same to the theist. We can say, well, how does God do all these things? How does God's mind ground logic? How does God do all these things? What are the mechanisms for you arriving to your conclusions versus mine? And you find that we're in the same boat. At the end of the day, we're in the same boat, and we're both making presuppositions. We're both asserting axioms that there's an external world, that we exist. I mean, these are fundamental axioms that we both can agree we have to presume. But there's nothing that the Presup offers, that the Presup view offers over an atheistic view. There's no metaphysical advantage. There's no logical advantage to being a Presupper. There's nothing that they have over an atheistic view. They just assert it. They just pretend they have some advantage because of largely their misunderstandings of the naturalistic views and many philosophical views. So that's all I wanted to describe here today. Hope you guys enjoyed, and hope I answered some of your questions and illuminated some of the issues here.